we wanted to actually tell the stories of these great growers, especially in the satellite regions that were making a high quality wine that nobody had really discovered before.
You're listening to the Vint Podcast, bringing you expert interviews, alternative market insights, and exclusive access to the world of wine and spirits investing. Enjoy the show.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Vint Podcast. My name is Brady, joined by Billy Galanko. Billy, how was your weekend?
It was great. Tasted a few interesting wines, had some champagne, but nothing like the wines you've been tasting in the past couple weeks.
Yeah, it hasn't been a crazy run, but I have had my share of concentrated tasting last week. Got to go to a dinner in New York on Thursday, hosted by some pretty cool guys in the New York wine scene and really the online wine scene. If you're not familiar with the world of online wine forums, wine berserkers, and folks on Cellar Tracker and certain Facebook groups, those are some cool spaces to look into. But yeah, I got to go up to New York on Thursday for a kind of producer-centered tasting. We brought bottles of Sine Qua Non, SQN as it's maybe commonly referred to, which is a California cult producer of Grenache and Syrah. It was really cool to be able to taste so many wines from across that portfolio, across so many vintages. I think we probably had around 18 or 20 individual bottles. And if you're not familiar with SQN, they do a separate wine every vintage, a different wine every vintage. So there's no, 2005 of this and the same one 5 years later. Everything's totally unique, each vintage. So that was really cool. I brought a 2009 Grenache. I thought it showed well. And yeah, they're awesome wines. We got to taste some 97 Salon Champagne and 06 Paul Roger Winston Churchill. So that was a treat as well. Someone was generous enough to bring those. Yeah, it was a great time.
Nice. What was your favorite that you tasted?
Yeah, it's tough. In general, and this is not a knock on SQN or the event at all, but this style of wines that they are just like isn't quite up my alley. So alcohol extremely high on these wines. And just like when you think of like big wine, big California wine, I'm not sure how you could get much bigger than these SQN wines. So it was just a little bit outside of like where I would typically drink. I really love the Grenache. They were coming fast and loose. Throwing out individual vintages or names is tough, but the Grenaches from that side of the portfolio I thought showed really well. And the one that I brought, the 2009, still had a ton of life in it and still a lot of fruit. So that was fun. But I think the real treat of the night in terms of just getting to try something was the 97 Salon Champagne. Yeah, just not something you have on the table every day, and certainly not something that I would probably ever buy myself to add to my cellar. So that was definitely a treat.
How was that drinking?
It was great. Yeah, the length of those wines are incredible. It really wasn't showing much of its age at all, I didn't think, which was interesting and a little bit surprising for me. Like the color was still like super clean. It was, yeah, crisp and like high acidity, vibrant. Yeah, I'd be interested to see it later too. Maybe I'll get that chance. But yeah, they're awesome wines. If you can afford to buy them or be in spaces where you get to try them, they're really special to taste. At the same time, I've had really great sparkling wine experiences at $40, $60, $70, $80 versus $1,800 too. And I know you can say the same. So not more just to our audience that it's special to have those kinds of wines. You don't need that to have a good experience at all. No.
Yeah. That's my favorite way to try these types of wines is in a tasting setting. Like, I really want to try them. I'm sure they're going to be amazing, but would they ever be amazing enough for me to spend all that and drink it? Probably not. But yeah, that's just me. So
I was talking with one of the guys I was seated next to about that very thing. It was like, where do you think the threshold is for you're actually getting like more quality, like something extremely tangible where you can say, yes, this $200 versus $500 is worth it. I'm just asking what like price number he thought that the cutoff generally was. And obviously it's different between wines and regions, but I said it was somewhere around $400 to $600 and he was thinking maybe it was somewhere around $800 or $900. But yeah, we definitely, I think, agreed that under $1,000 or over $1,000, you're paying for something way, way more than like what the wine could ever deliver, which certainly people would say that probably the number's 200. But for us, we were at least able to come to that consensus. So that was a cool conversation.
That makes sense. Yeah.
What do you think what do you think your number is?
I don't know. I've never thought about things in that realm. I for me, I'm like such a history and a wine nerd that like I love if there was something that was like really old or it was a storied producer, like I put a lot more stock in that anyway. So if you gave me like a $800 bottle from someone I'd never heard of and it just happens to cost that much and I don't get like the story or it's not a historical piece of something, I don't know if I would enjoy it as much in terms of an experience. The wine would be fine. So it's hard for me to peg.
Yeah.
I'd probably say from my limited experience with you, maybe in that $300 to $500 range, there's certainly champagnes that I've had that are in that $300 range that are exceptional. Like the quality, I could tell the difference between that and a $150 bottle of champagne.
Sure.
That's a small reference, but yeah, I don't know. I'm willing to pay for old history and stuff.
Yeah, I agree. I would pay multiples more than the number that I gave for something that was like, I don't know, 1943, something from France, like wartime stuff. But then if I'm buying it and paying the premium for the historical significance, like I'm less likely probably to drink it. So then it like comes outside of the realm of, oh, this is a beverage and into this is just a collectible or like an art piece or like a historical artifact. And so that makes me want to pay more for it versus I'm about to consume this and it's going to be all over. But maybe you would still drink it. I don't know.
I don't know. That's where I go all over the place. Then I've had Madeira from the 1800s and the early 1900s. And it's like, I love that because this is so old. Somebody made it 100 years ago and it still tastes amazing. Whereas instead of that, I could get like a Burgundy that's maybe 5 years old. That's $1,200 a bottle. I'm like, why would I do this when I could just get a 100-year-old thing and stare at it for a while, be in awe, and then drink it and be like, I know they're completely different wines, completely, but that's how my mind works. So I'm like, yeah. But that said, I love to taste those wines and the best wines in the world. I'm going to continue to do that and put myself in settings where I get to taste them. But in terms of my personal buying, that's just probably not going to be a huge hallmark of my personal cellar, which I'm already trying to drink down anyway. So
it's tough when just in comparing to Burgundy when we were out in Willamette Valley and tasting Chardonnay and Pinot Noir out there, like the fact that you could get a case of Beaufrère Pinot Noir or 2 cases of Granville Chardonnay for 1 bottle of Grand Cru, whatever from Burgundy. It's obviously different. There are differences that you can note, but it's a pretty tough trade-off.
Check back in those wines in 20 years, though, 20, 30 years. And then,
that's true, too.
Yeah, see what you think. Cool. No, that's exciting. Where were you guys tasting? What was the venue?
We were at Bobby Van's in Midtown. It's like a steakhouse. I don't know if you know it. Food was excellent, honestly. It was really great. The company was good. It was cool because it was several folks that knew each other and were like adjacent to the wine scene in New York, but then some other guys and girls who came in from outside the city and who had never been to an event together. So there were a lot of folks meeting for the first time. It was a lot of fun.
Cool. Nice.
Yeah, trying to pivot a little bit. Today's interview with John Troutman, who you have some ties to and shared history with. Before we get into that interview, I wanted to lead in talking and sharing a little bit with the audience about your background, because I know it's been a little bit of time maybe since we've done proper introductions for both of us, and we've definitely gained a lot more listeners in the last several months, especially into the new year this year. Why don't you give a few notes on how you came into wine, and then that will be a good segue into introducing John, who, like I said, you guys have some shared history and background.
Yeah, very outside of the very foundation. So it all started, my love of wine came actually from a love of geography and, weirdly enough, art history. So the very first wine I can remember seeking out particularly was a wine I randomly found in the grocery store my senior year of college. It was like a 2008 Washington State Syrah, or Shiraz, as it was labeled. So there I was like, I was just in the grocery store trying to find the oldest bottle of wine. I was graduated in 2012, so I was 4 years old. Anyway, so I was like, that's interesting. So after that, I really didn't get into wine at all. But A few years later, I would watch the movie Somm. I got the Wine Atlas as my first book because I really like maps. So I was like, cool, let me learn a little bit about the geography. Maybe if I buy a bottle, I can figure out where it's from. So that was novel. I did that, graduated grad school, actually with a master's in creative brand management and branding. So when I went to go apply to jobs, I actually ended up going to work at VaynerMedia. And my very first interview outside of the HR person screening call was with Jonathan Troutman, which is cool. So this whole podcast has come full circle. But one of the reasons that they had put him on is because we had the reverse job fair where I met some Vayner people. And during that time, I expressed a loose interest in wine. I thought it was interesting. And he had basically an extensive wine background. He had some sommelier, retail knowledge. He had worked with Gary to help try to launch like a wine text thing. He had worked with him in various aspects. So he had a passion for wine. So that was cool to be able to join Vayner and have somebody be an example of what a wine passion looked like. But yeah, no, that was my wine journey was really slow and dormant until about 2017. December 2016, I saw the movie Somm for the 50th time, the one that inspired me to get that book. Years earlier, I actually wondered how people applied to or start the process for Master Sommelier. I'm like, do you need to be working in a restaurant? Do you need to go to college? I don't know. Turns out you could just apply for the intro sommelier exam. And then once you pass that level, you could take the next one and so forth. So that December 2016, I applied. I signed up to take the test. I spent the next 3 months studying the wine Bible and just reading about wine. So I basically at that point knew nothing about wine. I knew that I had a wine atlas, but I didn't really ever read it. So I took the intro exam that March. It was cool. It's like for those who've never, I guess most people haven't taken the intro exam, it's pretty cool. It's like a 2-day crash course with just master sommeliers. They like basically in theory, if you hadn't studied, that you cover the whole study book that they give you, and they just walk you through every region, and a different master somm takes a section, and they're either favorite section or their area of expertise. You taste along the way, you do blind tastings, and at the very end of those 2 days, you take like a 50 question exam, like a written exam. So I was doing that. At that level, there's like people who are interested like me, and there are people who are in the industry just trying to get a little bit more credentials. So it's an interesting crowd. How does that compare to the level of WSET that you took, Brady, by the way?
Yeah. Did you do that in person? Yeah. So I did mine virtually. I started at level 2. It's hard to say because in WSET, level 1 and level 2 are both introductory, and you can start in one or the other. Level 1 is definitely more for you have almost absolutely no knowledge of the space at all. And level 2, I don't think they make assumptions about but it's definitely moves a little bit quicker, I believe. And it's just one person teaches it. They'll do the record, seminars, and you go through the book. But it's very similar in that everything within the workbook is correlated to the class, and you're only tested on that material. So it's pretty straightforward that way, at least in the early stages. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, what I do like about WSET and Wine and Spirits Education Trust is that they do provide you materials, and the Brits are very anal about testing what's in the book. Whereas the Master Somm folks, it is really study on your own, and here's also this guide like at the end. It's pretty
what makes the WSET a little bit difficult sometimes is it's so rigid in terms of what answers they accept, because it has to be like what's exactly from the book, that some of the more like gray area or nuanced questions that you can be like, well, actually, if you think about it this way, it just isn't accepted. For someone who's a really good student, that's good. But I'm not a good student. I'm more of just like a deductive reasoner. So I got myself talked out of a few right answers, I think.
Oh, yeah. That's definitely the rigidity in the WSET. Don't get me started on that. We may have to have a follow-up podcast on that process soon. We'll see after this week.
So, like, for people that don't know, Gary Vaynerchuk has definitely his, like, influencer, business, entrepreneurship, like, motivational kind of stuff. But he's also, like, deeply entrenched, and has been for a long time, deeply entrenched in wine sales, fine wine, all this kind of stuff. And actually, some of his first content creation came out of content creation around wine, right? And so John fits in there in that I believe he spent some time at Constellation, which is now one of the larger wine conglomerates here stateside, right?
Yeah.
And also with Gary's Empathy Wines, which was a project that they started and later sold. They didn't sell it to Constellation, right?
No, they did. They did. So yeah, Yeah, so circling back quickly there. So Gary's family started the wine library, which was just a shop in New Jersey, basically his dad's shop. And then he basically was like, why don't we try to sell these wines online? So he made a website in the very early days of websites, even to sell wine. Not early days of websites, early days of people selling things online. Then he started making a bunch of YouTube videos about wine, just talking about it, trying to sell it. And he started growing the business immensely. That's how John Troutman found him. And then from there, they connected. They started like a wine texting thing, like I was saying. And then he went on, he worked at Vayner while I was there. So I was there 2.5 years. He did a bunch of different roles, worked very closely with Gary. And then when Gary had always done some of his own private label wines based in Napa, there was one called Right Hook, which is a big Napa cab. But when they wanted to start their own direct-to-consumer wine brand, Jonathan Troutman was a co-founder with Gary on that, on Empathy. So they launched it together. He ran it. And then when it was acquired by Constellation, he actually they bought the team, not just the wine and the infrastructure. They bought a bunch of the team, and then he went and worked at Constellation for a couple of years before coming back and working with Gary again on VeeFriends, which is his NFT project.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So quickly, we'll go through here, picking up where I left off on my story. That was a big break. But intro sommelier exam, less than 6 weeks later. After that exam, though, if you've seen the movie Somm, you see they get a pin, they get all this stuff, they can put on their resume. After passing that exam, they were like, you can't put this on your resume and you don't get a pin. And I was like, what the hell? I want both of those things. So I signed up to take the certified exam less than 6 weeks later. This was like the end of March. I was taking it the first week of May. I didn't realize that it was supposed to be really hard. So I had a buddy who worked in New York at the time, owned a wine shop. So I went and practiced. I led some classes there. I practiced serving around my apartment. I tasted a bunch. And then, I took the exam with 15 other people. I think there were 16 people total. And that was in Virginia Beach, Virginia, just like the Cork Dork, if anybody's ever read that. She takes her intro in New York and then certified in Virginia Beach, weirdly enough. So I did that. And I was one of 2 people who passed that exam, which was sad because after the tasting component and the service component, I was like, there's a bunch of people, we went and got a drink and they were like, yeah, I really need this because I'm going to get a raise and all that. And I was like, I'm just here for fun. I hope it goes well. Yeah. So those guys who didn't get their raises, I kind of feel bad.
Maybe I should have done something that had the service portion, because at the dinner on Thursday, someone had opened all the wines to get some air to them before we started. And I went over to my bottle because I had cellophane wrapped around the label and I was just going to take it because I had it in my cellar and I was just going to take it off. And I grabbed the bottle and turn it on its side and start trying to peel it. And they're like, stop. All the wine is dumping out of the bottle onto the white tablecloth.
What?
All over the floor. And so luckily it wasn't like, I don't know, it was maybe like a glass that poured out of it. But I'm there like trying to pick the thing. It's just like glugging out of the top all over the white tablecloth on the floor, like right in front of the host.
Oh, man.
Anyways.
I'm surprised you haven't mentioned that yet. That's awesome.
Yeah. Sorry for that.
Oh, man. Yeah, no, the service component in the certified exam is not ridiculous, but it's a lot. You have to do sparkling service. So you get a bottle, you have to carry a tray with flutes on it and the bottle, and then go put those down and then serve everybody has to get the same amount. So you don't get to go around and just top up bottles. But you're serving a table with one master somm and like 6 invisible people. And when you come up, they point out who all the invisible people are. Like, this is my Aunt Jenny. This is my Uncle Steve. Because you have to basically serve in order of the person of honor, and then women first,
Sure.
and then men. And you can't like reach through people even if they're invisible. So like, at one point I had to switch to my left hand and say excuse me to an invisible person and pour with my left hand. That might have been why I passed barely on the service part. But I magically passed that exam. I didn't realize how hard it was. But then it sparked my love of wine. I tried to wean off wine. I thought maybe I was just studying outside of work and that was fun. So I got really into crypto. I found myself falling asleep when I was reading crypto books and not when I was reading wine books. So I thought maybe I should pursue this. So I ended up, TLDR to the rest of the story, I ended up quitting my job the end of that year in New York, went to go work a harvest at a winery in Australia that winter. So the winter of 2018, I guess it was summer there. And worked a harvest there. Ended up staying on working remotely in Australia for a few months after harvest at the company headquarters, heading up their like marketing and branding. Moved to LA, work remotely for them there. Did that. I had a little spell actually back at another Gary Vaynerchuk ad agency. He was trying to start one out here. While I was there, I wrote a wine ebook And that wine ebook is what ended up eventually leading me to Vint. Following that time at the agency, I worked at a local producer who has a winery here in Paso Robles, and they have estate vineyards in Paso Robles and in Monterey. And I helped them build 6 brands that they have based on 100% estate fruit, building that all from the ground up. So that was really neat. And while I was working there, Nick reached out and asked me if I wanted to do some wine writing for this company they were starting called Vint. Once he explained it, I thought it was really cool. I actually ended up investing in the company itself. And then from there, I started just asking them if what else I could do aside from writing to help the company. And I found out quickly that he and Patrick needed some help on the wine front as well as the marketing front. And worked, like, basically moonlighted for free with them for 2.5 months before coming on full time in June of 2021. And now I'm here.
Full circle.
Yeah, and now we have John Troutman on. That's the whole point of this conversation.
Right. Yeah, no, you started in June 2021. I started in November, and the first thing that I worked on that first week was the Vint podcast. And you and I like put a plan together and eventually decided that it would be both of us together towards the end of that year. Yeah, everything full circle. Do you want to intro John? I can just note that John's the Executive Vice President of Commerce and Operations at VeeFriends, which is, like Billy said, Gary Vaynerchuk's NFT project focused around animated characters promoting positivity, positive character traits, things like that. Certainly there's more to it. It's an extensive project that's been really successful, and John is a key figure there.
Yeah, he, like we mentioned earlier, he's been with Gary and helping out in different wine capacities for a long time. Also, while he was in New York, he built a wide network of sommelier friends, and he's been really in touch with the industry outside of just his work. So, like, he's friends with Andre Houston Mack, who's also one of Gary's good friends, but it's that caliber of sommelier that he's basically been able to keep up with living in New York for so long. So he had a wealth of knowledge and stories about wine and perspective on wine. We did touch a little bit on NFTs at the end there and how the project, the VeeFriends, is evolving, but we really did just focus a lot on wine, what it's like building a direct-to-consumer wine brand from scratch, what it's like working at a big conglomerate like Constellation. So I thought I learned a lot, and we gained a really unique kind of perspective on the wine industry that we haven't covered yet.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. Here is John.
Hi, John. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely happy to be with you.
Yeah, so I will not have said this in our little bit of an intro. John here was my actual first official interview at Vayner, I think. I had an HR call that basically was a screener to make sure I wasn't crazy after a fair, basically it was a job fair at my old grad school. So this is bringing it all full circle, reconnecting on the phone again.
Yeah. We both have more grays than we did back then, but I think we're holding up all right. We age like fine wine.
Yeah, but so since my time at Vayner, I left, and then you have gone all over the place, and you've had your fingers in a lot of different things. You helped Gary launch not VeeFriends, sorry. You helped Gary launch Empathy Wines, which was then bought by Constellation, and now you're at VeeFriends. Can you let everybody know from the beginning of like how you started your career, also how you got into wine, and then how it's crescendoed to where you are today?
Yeah, absolutely. I love wine. It remains my largest passion. I've been in and out of the industry throughout my career. So I started working in wine originally as a bartender and then later as a wine director at my family's restaurant. I graduated in 2008 during the original financial crisis. And ultimately, what steered me away from maybe a job in management consulting or otherwise, because nobody was hiring, turned out to be a real blessing. It forced me to do what an actual passion that I had was. I was lucky enough to, through my homework studying through the Court of Master Sommeliers program, to come across at the time, lesser known guy named Gary Vaynerchuk through YouTube videos where he was producing wine content for his family's wine shop, the Wine Library. And I went down the rabbit hole of consuming his content and using it as really a study resource for me and my wine journey and learning. After a while, I recognized that not only was this person very versed and an educational resource for all things wine, but really had a business acumen of how to communicate and market to consumers in a very contemporary and modern way. And so he kind of checked both boxes of my interests between wine and marketing. I ended up meeting him at the Boston Wine Expo in 2009 and took it upon myself to say, hey, if there are any job opportunities where we could kind of like partner up and work together, I would jump at the opportunity. The short of it is, I ended up moving to New York City without ever having visited it about 2 weeks later.
Wow.
Yeah, with no real formal job description or even understanding of what we were going to be doing together. But it just seemed like a great opportunity, and I trusted my gut. So the opportunity that I ended up moving to New York for was with an early stage wine social network startup called Corked. So it's funny, hindsight teaches us a lot of things, but there's no such thing as really a successful, highly niche social network today. I think we all now know that between Reddit, Facebook, and Twitter, the scale and general social networks ended up winning out. At the time, though, we had a real hunch and an inkling that there were going to be micro social networks. It was really the early days of Facebook when people for the very first time were like building true community online in a meaningful way. And we saw white space for the wine industry. Our end goal was really not just to connect consumers where they would have a place to be able to engage one-to-one with each other about Bordeaux and Burgundy and Napa and German Riesling, but really our ultimate end game was to bring the producers into that equation. So how do the houses in Champagne or that micro producer in Oregon ultimately find and reach their consumer? Which fast forward 15 years later, and I still don't know that product's truly been built in a meaningful way. Who knows? Maybe there's a future business somebody out there will be inspired to build. But that was really our end goal. We were a small and scrappy team of really only 3 full-time people. Myself, Gary as a chairman, and 2 other people, a developer and a CEO from Harvard Business School. And we saw some really good early success. I'll say at a personal level, it was such an incredible opportunity. It fused all of my interests between the wine side of things that I had been starting to go down with the business, marketing, and innovation things that I had a budding interest in. So it was really a crash course in how to work at a high growth startup within a category that I loved. At the same time, Gary's personal career outside of wine was really just getting ready to catapult. He had simultaneously started VaynerMedia, which at the time was a niche social media marketing agency in a world where no other competitors existed because nobody else was doing that work. But it started taking off quickly. I think just as fast as Facebook and Twitter and Tumblr were growing, VaynerMedia kind of followed suit, and marketers were quickly realizing that they needed to figure out how to reach their consumers on those platforms. I used it as an opportunity to transition my career and move away from the wine industry and instead focus more on kind of the business and innovation side of things. So we made the really hard decision to close the doors at Corked in 2020. Oh, no, excuse me. When was that? In 2011.
Yeah.
Very different. And then I moved over to VaynerMedia, which is where I met you, Billy. Vayner was probably, again, from a career standpoint, an incredible learning in how to take a business from a concept and an idea and really hungry, young, green talent into a company that could scale and grow and work with some of the largest brands in the world. So I think when I joined that company full time, it was at the time around 25 employees. When I left to ultimately go on and start Empathy Wines in 2017, I think it was 1,200 people with global offices in Singapore, South America, all over the world. And so just an incredible experience to go from small to big in a very short period of time. But what was so exciting for me too was to get like a behind the scenes look at how do some of the biggest brands in the world and household names actually run and operate and think about the way they sell product, engage their consumers, go to market with new ideas and new innovations while doing it from a client services perspective and working at a company that thankfully VaynerMedia was much more nimble, and it was run by an entrepreneur who was very hands-on and ensuring that we like maintained a lot of speed.
Yeah. I just wanted to maybe pause and hover a little bit over the decision to, at least at the initial stage, to move away from wine and more towards marketing. Was that, you talked about it being a difficult decision to close up. You said in 2011, corked. What was the thought process there? Was wine still very much like a passion and just didn't see it as something that you could sustain as a career? Or what were you going through when you made that decision?
Yeah. So when we ended up shuttering the doors for Corked in 2011, at a personal level, it was a challenging decision to make of whether I wanted to go off and continue working at another wine company where I had really just started kind of like cutting my teeth in the industry, or if I wanted to make like a seemingly pretty big pivot and go over to work at a marketing agency. A lot of sleepless nights, and I struggled with it. But for me, I recognized that I would get a lot of career experience if I ever wanted to go back into wine by working with a lot of brands across a lot of other different categories, whether they be wine and spirits, consumer packaged goods in general, or otherwise. And so that's the path I ended up going down. At the same time, I made a commitment to stay close with a lot of the friends that I'd started to make in like the budding New York City wine scene, just knowing that down the line I might want to return to the industry. And so that meant staying close with friends that are, whether they be beverage directors or sommeliers at wine restaurants, people in the import and distribution business here in New York. I think it's just such an incredible wine market, an incredible wine scene, especially for European wines and also just like fine wine in general, that I didn't want to lose that. And I feel really grateful to this day that I've maintained a lot of those relationships and a lot of those friendships that I'd started to build at Corked. In terms of
one quick question, there was one of those. When did you meet Andre Mack? We had him on recently, and he had mentioned that you guys were obviously good friends, along with him having his kids play with Gary's. Was that one of the sommeliers you kept up with?
Yeah, Andre is an old friend of Gary's, probably going back 25 years now. I think they originally met when Andre was the opening wine director of Per Se here in New York. For anyone that doesn't know, Per Se is arguably the top fine dining restaurant in the city. And from the story that I've heard, Gary came in, was this loudmouth Jersey guy who was taking a look at the wine list, and I guess the sommeliers were absolutely blown away when he started ordering things like Reyes and Krug and some of these other like boutique and really well-known wines. And the two of them hit it off. And I think it makes sense why the two of them would become fast friends. Both of them incredibly wine knowledgeable and have incredible experience in the industry. But both, I think, set the blueprint for this industry in saying that fine wine doesn't need to be pretentious. You can know a lot and not be a jerk and come across you know it all. And instead, both of them in their own unique and distinct ways are able to make wine approachable and fun without dumbing it down, which I think that's a really hard thread to weave, which a lot of people struggle with. But both of them have figured it out, and I think is a testament to why they've both been successful in their various careers and ventures in the wine industry.
I definitely agree.
What's, John, like when you think about wine business and the decisions to go back and forth between marketing and wine, obviously you've had your hand in wine since then. What's the most challenging thing, especially maybe in those early days, and how it's changed over the last 10 years, managing a wine business and making a wine business profitable, especially in a place like New York?
Yeah, I think wine, I'll start by saying every industry has its nuances and challenges and can be challenging for a whole variety of different reasons. All that said, I think wine and spirits at large is maybe one of the hardest categories to crack because there's so much regulation and so much guardrails that are built in that date back hundreds of years at this point, especially within the United States, that make it really hard. And I'll say to the detriment of both the consumer and the producer, which I would say are the most important pieces in the value chain of what the industry consists of. Because of that, I think a lot of bad behaviors have been built in of marketers and businesses that operate in this industry purely because they've been forced to do things in a very specific way. And if you look outside of the category at other industries, they've just been more innovative because they haven't been hamstrung by some of the laws exist. For me, I would say that's been like a big learning in my career that I didn't know when I was first cutting my teeth in the space, that if you're selling chocolate or you're selling another product, sometimes it's just a lot easier to reach your consumer because you're not restricted in some ways that we are here in wine and spirits.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you find that communicating Like, aside from the restrictions that maybe are placed on how you can communicate, did you find that the audience is either like less or more willing to hear from wine and spirits brands at that time versus now? Like, what do you think has been the uptake culturally on folks' interest in engaging with brands like that?
Yeah, I think it's been pretty incredible. And I'm not that old of a guy, but this industry has changed so much just in the last like 15 or 20 years. I think in the United States, you've had this interesting dichotomy where there's a certain subset of consumers who, for the very first time, want to get educated and have more resources to get educated than ever before. It no longer need to go off to a textbook and dust it off in order to learn. Like, there are incredible wine shops that provide education, incredible platforms online that are just like a couple clicks of a button away to learn those things.
Sure.
And so there's more access and resource, and there's better wine than ever before being imported and even just made domestically. So it's exposing people to that wine. On the flip side, it's interesting that the wine industry is shrinking. Like, we're losing market share to products like whether it be hard seltzers or even like alternatives like cannabis. And I think while you've seen like incredible growth and success with a certain subset of consumers who are finally for the first time ever discovering the virtues of fine wine, on the whole, we're actually losing with those people because they're finding alternatives, whether it be alcohol or alternatives to alcohol, where it's eating its lunch. It's like the shame of it all. I think now it's the responsibility, and it's going to be absolutely mission critical to wine marketers to figure out, like, how do you reach those people? How do you get them to explore a bottle of Terrell Dago or Pinot Noir from Sonoma or whatever it might be, and get them to do it in a way that is approachable and actually gets them to want to learn more. So nobody's really fully cracked that nut. Hopefully the three of us could hatch a plan and figure it all out. I think that's really what the responsibility of the industry is at this point.
Yeah, I think that's where people are looking to learn more, and that storytelling is coming at the right time, where people are looking at wine less as a purely an intoxicant or something to make them feel a certain way. They want to learn about the craft and everything that goes into it. I think that's definitely true. And also, once people start learning, as we all know, you can't stop. I've been saying Terrell to go instead of however you properly pronounce the grape for all this time. Yeah, there's endless pathways for people to go down. But when, in that sense, with, to your point, wine is getting better in a sense of fault-free. There's more baseline quality wine, maybe less character in some wines. How do you go about launching a new wine brand? Like, when you guys were getting started with this idea, was it quality wine first and building a brand, or did you have the brand idea and try to figure out how you're going to get into the wine?
Yeah. So the birth and concept of empathy came from a few different places. I think at a category level, we just recognized that the consumer was oftentimes overwhelmed and being crippled by choice. You walk into a wine shop and there are so many different labels and so many different varieties and types that for 99% of people, it just creates an absolute paradox of choice. They don't know where to begin. On top of that, the wine marketers weren't really making that any easier for people. You have different labeling laws. Do you name by grape or do you name by region? It depends if you're in Europe or you're in the United States. Like, it just made things really hard for the end consumer. On top of that, I think going back to that regulatory environment we were touching on earlier, the US system specifically makes wine expensive. And I would argue unnecessarily. That's not to say that there isn't the role of a distributor that provides value in the form of everything from brass tacks of trucking and shipping right down to greater distribution and shelf placement for brands. But at the same time, that three-tier system ultimately makes consumers have to pay more for high quality wine. And so for us, that meant we have to sell direct to consumer to provide the best wine possible for our customer base. And then finally, like, the name was very representative of what our mission was. We didn't just by accident pick the name Empathy Wines. Really, it started with we wanted to have empathy for that consumer. They're overloaded with choice and they've had to pay too much for good, high quality wine for too long, but also empathy for the grower. Where, yes, in very fine wine, people who have done their homework know the story behind DRC and like why it's so incredible that Aubert de Villaine is like such a special guy. But for 99% of the other wines in the world and 99% of consumers that haven't done that homework, they know nothing about the people behind really high quality wine. And so for us, that was in our marketing. We wanted to actually tell the stories of these great growers, especially in the satellite regions that were making high quality wine that nobody had really discovered before. People know what Napa Valley is and what like Oakville and Rutherford and these like sub appellations within Napa Valley stand for. And that's why those wines tend to cost so much money. What they don't know are the great growers that have 4 generations of history in Lodi and in Mendocino and in Clarksburg and all of these other great areas where we started in Northern California. And so for us, it was like, let's shine a light on Scott Bilbrough, who's now the 3rd generation of his family and growing such an incredible grape growing business and doing it with Syrah vines that date 120 years old at this point. Like it's just it was an untapped opportunity for us that we actually didn't even want to be that big of the equation. We wanted it to be more about them than it was even about ourselves at Empathy Wines. I'll stop there. I know that was a little bit long-winded, but hopefully some good stuff to work with.
And do you want to talk? I'm just curious because I'm looking here at this site and it's very stripped down in terms of labeling, in terms of the wines that are presented. I know Constellation came in, you guys were able to have the brand acquired. How has it changed since before and after Constellation took over? Do you feel like the product set that you have there is pretty much the same?
Yeah. So the quick story on our growth. So we were really fortunate to see a lot of growth and success in a fairly short period of time, which I think is probably a testament to that we were onto something with what we were building at Empathy Wines. We were fortunate enough to ultimately become friendly and get a good understanding with what the leadership at Constellation was envisioning. And it really aligned with what we were building at Empathy. There was a recognition that the bulk of their business would continue to be driven by the scale that the 3-tier system provides, especially at the higher end of their category. There was untapped opportunity to continue to grow their direct-to-consumer business. The irony was that shortly after we had a handshake deal to ultimately sell Empathy to them, COVID came and it forced consumers to buy online for the first time when shopping for wine in droves. And that definitely was a big tailwind for us in growing the business. The exciting opportunity for me at a personal level in selling Empathy Wines was they didn't just want to buy our brand. They wanted to bring in our team to help build their entire direct-to-consumer capability. And that meant me going with it. So I joined as a leader of the direct-to-consumer team at Empathy Wines about 3 years ago at Constellation. And I got an opportunity to work with some of the most iconic brands in the world, whether it be Robert Mondavi or the Prisoner Wine Company, these like high-growth, iconic brands and labels that Constellation owned and operated, and replicate the same type of marketing and sales efforts and channels for those brands in addition to Empathy. I'll stop. Brady, did that answer the question or do you want me to go fill in any other gaps?
Yeah, I came to the site and I see 3 different red wines: Empathy Red, 2019 Empathy Red, 2021 Empathy Red. Very similar in terms of labeling and it seems like style. Really stripped down for the consumer. And it seems like that, I was just trying to get to, you saw that idea, that concept really was meeting a need right away, which I think is not what we expect when we go to sites and we see long lists of tasting notes and droves and droves of information on some of these producers that go direct to consumer. So I'm just interested in how that model was received.
Yeah. So with the wines themselves, the vast majority that we've produced with Empathy Wines have been blends. And that was very much by design for a couple of reasons. We found that the majority of consumers don't really care or know enough about the specific grape varietals themselves to be able to say that I want a Cabernet Sauvignon or I want a Cabernet Franc. On top of that, and even more importantly, it gave us a lot of flexibility to make the best possible wine each and every year in a consistent way. And I think in many ways, I would draw inspiration from like the champagne houses and what they do each and every year, where you have a consistent house style. But that doesn't mean that they're sourcing from the exact same vineyards or even that it's the exact same blend of Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, and Pinot Meunier. We wanted to do something similar. And that's why it's a general California appellate wine. It's not specific to an AVA. And those blends are going to be subject to change based on the best possible fruit that we could source that year. I think we all know, being members of the industry, that what happens in the Russian River can be wildly different than what happens next door in Healdsburg in any given growing season. And for us, that gave us just like a blank slate to say, how do we just blend the best possible wine for the consumer that given year? So that's really why they're all blends for the most part. And then we went with a California designate style. All that said, I think we do not want to dumb it down. I think we've seen other people in the wine industry that have gone too far by simplifying it for the consumer. Like, we want to educate them. We want them to know why we've sourced from certain growers and why we've elected to do a certain blend in a certain year. And I think that trend is true even outside of wine, right? If you go into Whole Foods and you look at some of the most successful brands, they've won with consumers for a reason. It's because there's an authentically made product. They're giving transparency to the consumer and how it was actually made. And in some cases, it came from the grower themselves. I think there's a lot of parallels even outside of wine of why certain brands are winning with consumers, based on like trends that you're seeing, that people actually care what they're consuming now and they care where it comes from, like they didn't even just a few years ago.
Did you find that there were more efficient or effective ways to share some of these stories than just putting a really long back label or like a tech note? Were you guys sharing like videos, or how did you tell these stories in a more dynamic manner?
Yeah, I think that's where that was probably our bread and butter. Is we had never actually made wine before, although we knew a lot about high quality wine and we knew what the consumer's pain points were. But even more so than that, we knew how to reach consumers in a really effective and efficient way. And so like when you looked at right down to at a tactical level, the channels that we were on, we weren't running right-hand rail banner ads that nobody actually pays attention to. Like, all of our efforts went to channels like Twitter and Instagram and TikTok, where people were actually spending their time and attention. I think, Billy, to your point around right down to the bottles themselves, we had QR codes on the back labels dating back to 2017, because we recognized that more and more consumers were going to start to use those QR codes. And those QR codes would go to a landing page where you'd have a video talking about that specific wine, because chances are that's a better way for them to remember the details of a brand than to save the bottle itself and be able to like read that very small fine print. So it's, I would say, just modern day communication was 100% our focus. And how do we do it in a way that like tells the actual brand story, or in this case, even the grower story that we were sourcing from, because that was such a big opportunity.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It might have been Vayner that instilled this in me, but I've been yelling about QR tags for, it feels like 8 years, with nobody's ever going to use those. That's a Chinese thing. And then all of a sudden COVID hit and they're everywhere. I'm like, see, like I should have stayed there and been the champion. When you were saying you've never made wine before, Gary did have a few private labels like here and there, right? Like I remember one bottle that would always be around the office just had like a boxing glove on it. There was a few connections with producers there, aside from just selling their wines.
Yeah, no, that's very true. I'll say I had never been personally involved in some of those projects. Gary himself, through his family's wine store, the Wine Library, produced a lot of different private labels. You think about how those private labels are often made. Well, he would always be very involved in the sampling and trial and kind of like bench trials for what went into those blends. He was never like contracting fruit purchases in the same way that we were with Empathy Wines. I would say we were just much more hands-on for the very first with Empathy in a way that we just hadn't been earlier with different private label initiatives.
Can you maybe quickly explain to you what a private label is for our listeners? Because I don't think most people realize, like when they go to Trader Joe's, for example, like a vast majority of those are just private labels specifically made for Trader Joe's.
Yeah, I would say if you go in, to your point, the vast majority of mid and large size wine retailers, whether it be the Costco's and Trader Joe's of the world at one extreme, or the larger independents like a Wine Library, they're oftentimes looking to be able to provide their customer with a wine that they can't get anywhere else. And there's a variety of reasons why you would do that. One of which is you just want to make and be involved in the blending of a wine yourself. Oftentimes, like, we get into this industry and we love it, as whether we're the retail side or otherwise, But to be able to actually be involved in the blending of a wine, that's fun. That's really exciting. And all of a sudden you're providing your thumbprint on an actual bottle of wine for the very first time. From a business perspective, it's an awesome chance to actually produce a really high quality bottle of wine and to make more money on it. The reality is those retailers for very popular, highly sought out wines, they don't make very much money on them. And the reason is they have such wide distribution that it's really supply and demand. If something has a lot of supply and it's widely available, it forces the other people to be more competitive in their pricing. And so oftentimes some retailers are making as little as like a penny of margin selling a highly popular wine SKU, whether it's like a Kendall Jackson Chardonnay or the Prisoner Red Blend or whatever it might be. A private label allows you to strip out that competition and offer something exclusively that might make them a little bit more profit margin that they just can't get elsewhere.
When Constellation comes and finally you're ready to do a deal, what does that process look like? We haven't talked about that too much on the podcast. I know we've had a few folks who've gone through acquisitions similar to that, but was just curious from a business perspective, what does an acquisition like that look like?
Yeah. I'll say I think the way that we did our deal with Constellation is very atypical. In the M&A process is oftentimes a very like formal thing. Either a seller or a buyer might engage a bank specifically to serve as an intermediary, ultimately go on a shopping spree if they're the buyer and saying, hey, we're looking to acquire a high-end Sonoma Pinot Noir producer. And then they go out and do a lot of diligence on different prospects that might be willing to sell their brand and their brainchild that they built over years and years. In our case, we actually had a pre-existing relationship with the president of the wine and spirits division at Constellation, somebody who we had known for years through other categories and industries that he had worked in, Robert Hansen, who was my boss while I worked at Constellation Brands, and can't speak highly enough about. His experience working in luxury and retail in other categories were big principles that he was looking to bring in at Constellation. And one of those strategies was focusing on the premium end of the market and building out a direct-to-consumer capability for the entire category. And over some casual catch-up drinks and a couple cups of coffee and him learning a little bit more about what we had started building at Empathy Wines, there was a strategic recognition by Robert that it's a whole lot easier to buy it oftentimes than it is to build it from scratch. And so that's what ended up playing out was they acquired our brand, Empathy Wines. They acquired our team to come in and build that capability across the rest of their portfolio. And at a distant third, they were acquiring a quote unquote tech stack. I don't know how nerdy some of the audience that's listening to this is, but we had launched our company on the backs of a Shopify Plus based tech stack. We were using a data warehouse in order to store all of this customer information so that we had real insights on who these people were, how they were behaving, different segmentation of our customers, and that like data opportunity to be able to take some of those insights and learn more about their consumer was really important to Constellation as well. And so those were the things that we came in and implemented across the rest of the portfolio as well in our first couple of years there.
Yeah, that's cool.
But
That's good insight.
I guess bringing it full circle to your question, Brady, this was a very atypical deal that was done direct with their leadership team. And it was born on a pre-existing relationship, a belief in what Constellation was building, and a belief that we could help like turbocharge that. And if anything, they would make Empathy Wines brand that much better. Like they're really good at what they do in sourcing wine, making really high quality wine at fair price points, and introduce a lot of quote unquote operational excellence that we just didn't have as a startup.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Billy, do you want to move in and talk a little bit about VeeFriends here, move out of wine?
Yeah, we can do. Let's talk a little NFT chat, and then I do want to pick your brain on what you're drinking these days and personally into. But yeah, were you into NFTs at all? For the listeners of this podcast, they know I've gone on a mini spree of basically buying every wine NFT that was available for a period of time, but now there's too many. I don't. Yeah, how did you get into NFTs in general? Then how did that lead you to VeeFriends?
Yeah. At a personal level, I was just paying a lot of attention to this emerging quote unquote Web3 space in late 2020 and early 2021. I've learned a ton since then about the technology and like its use cases for business. And I think it's a fascinating kind of industry to be in today. At the same time, it's one that I think is still in its earliest days. I think we're still in the first inning of a nine inning game. I think when it comes to the wine industry, Billy, to your point, there was like this mass rush by the industry a couple of years ago to be like, we all have to launch a wine NFT. I'm actually
Yeah.
of the belief now that eventually that might be true. There might be a necessity for our industry and just about any brand in it to adapt to this technology. I think today there's a fairly like narrow use case for NFTs as it relates to wine. And for me, probably the greatest opportunity that exists is at the fine wine and very
Mhm.
high end side of the market, particularly where there's counterfeiting concerns and issues. I'm oversimplifying it, but like at the end of the day, what an NFT provides is a ledger, and with that, like a proof of ownership and the provenance that we in the industry have all been trying to crack for years and years. So when I think about whether it be the DRCs of the world or these other ultra high end Burgundy and Bordeaux producers, where the consumer doesn't necessarily have an assurance of that a wine isn't counterfeit or that it hasn't been stored properly or that it hasn't been owned by like 20 different people prior before they ultimately acquire it for their seller. I think for the first time ever, blockchain technology and quote unquote NFTs like allow us to actually provide the consumer that assurance and a paper trail. And of course, it's a physical good. And so, with a physical good, there's always going to be concerns around storage and things like that you can't completely mitigate. But I do think the technology unlocks the ability to say, hey, this person actually acquired this wine. It truly came from this producer. And here's the undeniable proof of ownership through the blockchain that for those producers cannot be ignored. And I'm like personally paying a lot of attention to that side of the space to see what some of these different producers and platforms that emerge that can help support those efforts.
Yeah, I think you're spot on there. The initial wave was all attached to like singular bottles, and it was very strange. You get this thing, you'll get an experience, and we'll also send you this thing that is not actually attached. And then I've tried to join the other clubs too, and there's a few, but basically one is launching just like you were describing, kind of with producers working hand in hand, and they basically track it from the winery to a bonded warehouse. And then once you decide to pull your wine from the bonded warehouse, the NFT is burned and it shows that like this is where it went. And I think they're working on some sort of subsequent tokens that go from there. But again, to your point though, the utility there, if I'm buying something that was only stored in a bonded warehouse, that means it's never left professional storage anyway. So I'm like, the NFT hasn't like really added that much utility yet, but I think it's moving in the right direction.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think, again, like looking outside of the category for inspiration, if you look at what Nike did with their recent acquisition of a brand called Artifact, I think it's a great glimpse into where the wine industry will need to go over time. So,
Hmm.
just like wine, sneakers have become ultra collectible. And with that have come counterfeits and questions of authenticity and where were those sourced. On top of that, from a direct to consumer standpoint, sneakers are increasingly like trying to get off of Foot Locker and Amazon and have a direct one to one relationship with the end consumer. What Artifact built was exactly that. And similarly, I think Nike recognized it's easier to buy it than it is to build it. They acquired a 2-year-old or 3-year-old NFT based shoe brand for millions and millions of dollars with the recognition that this is where the industry was going. I think in many ways, the wine industry will follow suit, albeit probably 5 to 10 years behind that. So that would be maybe a little bit of a futurist view, but I'm super excited to see like how it all plays out over the next decade or so.
I wonder who when I think of the high-end wine brands, especially in France, like which ones might adopt something like that soonest. Champagne feels like it comes to mind. I just feel like pretty innovative in terms of, just like consumer marketing. And this isn't exactly consumer marketing, but just like being in touch with some of those technologies. I don't know if you had any thoughts on that, but
I totally agree with you. I think if you look at champagne and probably LVMH specifically,
Yeah.
They, more than anybody else in our industry, I would argue, actually understand how consumers buy, especially at the luxury end of the market. They do things radically differently than how Bordeaux does it and how Burgundy does it and
Yeah.
how even Napa Valley, for the most part, does it, although LVMH has slowly but surely been acquiring brands in each of those regions to replicate the success they've had in Champagne. And I totally agree with you, Brady. I think if there's anybody that's going to crack that nut, I would put my money on it that they're the first to figure it out. At the same time, I actually think the use case we're talking about might apply best to Burgundy, only because it's such a collector's item and has become the preeminent like collector's category, and there's so little of that wine made. I would love to see the fusion between the LVMH provenance approach, but maybe applied to Burgundy specifically.
Yeah. That's true. That the differences in just production volume in general make it kind of a prime candidate, even outside of the fact that there's so many iconic brands there. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. But one counterpoint to that, though, is Champagne's always been on the forefront of marketing and quasi-innovation in general, even since the 1800s, and Burgundies were farmers 20, 30 years ago. So they still are. They're barely moving out there. So it'll be interesting to see how use case meets somebody who may not be as open to it as the other way kind of goes the same way.
Yep.
How prevalent is counterfeiting in Champagne, though, given the style of production? Is it... Do you know, Billy or John?
No, I don't know. Yeah, I was like, yeah,
I'm not sure. I'm not sure how you counterfeit Champagne.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think I haven't heard that much about it. That's not one of the really prominent ones. But again, I think it goes back to John's point on the volume. There's only a few producers, if you think more of like the Salas or Oriat, I can't pronounce all these names very well, but that are producing that low volume that are now reaching prices that are worth the time of fraudsters to really spend the time to try to make that. Whereas you could do one Burgundy bottle and make $30,000. There's a little bit of a change there. So I think the effort is limiting some of the fraud, but we can see. I think there's more experiential components that can also go along with the provenance with an NFT for Champagne that offer opportunity.
Yeah.
So speaking of different regions, unless you want to talk about, is there anything really exciting that's coming out with VeeFriends that you just can't get off your chest? Because I know it's taken a few twists and turns. VCon is big now. Do you want to just explain a little bit about what it is and what your roadmap is for 2023?
Yeah. So for the uninitiated, VeeFriends was originally quote unquote an NFT project that launched in 2021. Although the mission and what we've been building towards would really just be a modern day intellectual property company. That sounds very like buzzwordy. I would say maybe a better way to describe it is what Disney started and built over 100 years ago and what like Sesame Street more recently has built. We're looking to build the modern day version of that. And so what I mean by that is VeeFriends consists of 250 characters originally minted on the blockchain that convey different virtues and values that are meaningful to our creator, Gary Vaynerchuk. So you have the empathy elephant, you have the kind kudu, you have the ambitious angel, and you have all of these different characters that we're looking to make the next Elmo and the next Mickey Mouse and the next Aladdin, et cetera, et cetera. We have a long way to go before kids are ultimately asking for their kind kudu doll instead of Elmo. That's not lost on us. But if you look at the way that we've been growing the business, it's been through a lot of different mediums and channels, some of which are NFTs and like different campaigns and different ways to engage consumers through like Web3 technology, some of which is more mainstream. So you can find our content and our videos on YouTube and Instagram, and we're engaging with consumers on Twitter. And we've also even started to commercialize those characters and that intellectual property in a lot of different ways. One example, actually, that'll speak to our viewers would be like collaborations with Empathy Wines. When I was at Constellation, we teamed up to release the first collaborative wine blend with Empathy and VeeFriends. And I think to your question, Billy, like what to expect and what's on the roadmap ahead, I would say it's all of the above of everything I just described. Probably a lot more animated content to actually introduce these consumers to people. I would say on top of that, probably more partnerships and more commercialization of the brand too, with brands like Empathy Wines and brands in other categories too. It's our early days. It's been an exciting ride for me to join the company. Again, another venture outside of the wine industry. So I miss being in the space day to day, but it's also a really exciting time to be in kind of a space at its earliest stages.
Nice. I know since we last worked together, you've become a father. So hopefully your child can basically be one of these forefronts. They won't know Elmo. They'll only know the VeeFriends.
His genuine giraffe doll is in his crib as we speak.
That's awesome. Back to wine. Since you are a father, you probably need a glass here or there when you do have a spare minute, which probably isn't that often. But what are you drinking these days? Or at least what wine regions do you find most interesting today?
Yeah. I would say for the most part, I tend to drink a lot of European wines, although I love to explore the rest of the world too. I think what we've seen happen in the collectible fine wine side of our industry has forced me to change my wine buying and wine drinking habits. I used to be able to, on a Friday night, open a really special bottle of Chablis from Ravenel or Dauvissat or a nice bottle of Burgundy. Those wines, for the most part, are priced out of me outside of like very special occasions. And I've been, like a lot of the rest of us, been forced to like drink more and more of like the emerging regions of the world, which has actually been a good problem to have. I think all of a sudden I'm exploring more wines from the Savoie or from different emerging parts of Spain, returning maybe to places like Santorini that I think make really high quality wine for fractions of a dollar compared to some of those blue chip regions like Bordeaux and Burgundy. So for me, it's a lot of new and emerging wines. And I think, Billy, you touched on it earlier, and I couldn't agree more. Wine quality today is better than it's ever been. And so because of that, you can reliably go to a lot of different regions and just be assured that you're going to get not only a drinkable bottle of wine, chances are it's even better than it was that same producer was making it 10, 15, 20 years ago. For me, it's like actually just forcing myself to be more exploratory instead of going back to the same old regions every single day.
It's a good point that even on maybe like the grocery store side, I think sometimes consumers think, oh, I better be really careful what I pick because I could choose something really horrible. And if I make the right choice, it's going to be really good. But honestly, like basically everything out there, just because of the limited shelf space and the competition with distribution, all of that, the quality, the floor for quality is certainly raised. It's hard to choose something that you'd have to spit out and pour down the drain from the store.
Yeah. No better time to be a wine drinker.
Yeah, I agree. And it's so funny. We went to Friuli last year and just going around, and I always mess up Skipetino and Schiappetto, but whichever one is the right one that I'm mixing up. It's so funny that they brought the stainless steel, really clean style of winemaking to Northeast Italy. And that kind of took everything by storm. And we're going to make these really clean, non-faulty wines. And then now that generally raised the quality of all wines to the point where a lot of things are fault-free. And now everybody's going back a little bit more towards maybe not quite natural, but maybe a little bit more unfined, unfiltered, or leaving a little bit more character and trying to find that balance. So to your point, I think that's why we're in the perfect like limbo, or at least leaning there, because no longer is something way too bready or way too clean. It's like right in the middle. It's nice and a balance.
Couldn't agree more.
Awesome.
So sorry, guys. You need to get wrapped up pretty quickly.
No, that was it. That was the end there. So thank you so much for joining us today. Sorry for running over there a little bit.
Awesome. Guys, thank you so much for having me. This is fun as always, Billy. Great excuse to catch up, and a lot of fun talking all things technology, business, and fine wine.
All right, that was our interview with Jonathan Troutman. I hope everybody enjoyed the interview and got a little bit out of our stories, learned a little bit about my background, learned what not to do at a wine tasting with Brady and pour out your wine everywhere. We will spend the weekend not pouring out wine, and we will be back next week with a new episode. Cheers.
To check out our current offerings and to sign up for the Vint platform, find us at www.vint.co. That's www.vint.co. For questions, comments, or feedback on the Vint podcast, please email us at support@vint.co. Vint and VV Markets are offering securities pursuant to Regulation A. Our offering circular as amended can be found on the SEC website. Past performance is no guarantee of future results. Investments such as those on the Vint platform are speculative and involve substantial risks to consider before investing. We may provide communication that may contain certain forward-looking statements that are subject to various risks and uncertainties. Information provided in any communications, including this podcast, is not legal, business, or tax advice. All prospective investors should consult a legal, tax, or business advisor concerning the subject matter of any communications and any offering.